Hello everyone. Before we get started, I would just like to gently remind you to like and subscribe to the channel and share in the comments where you're from and what time you're watching. This will help YouTube continue to show you stories like this one. Now, let's dive in. I've been driving trucks for a living for about 15 years. I can tell you, nothing can truly prepare you for what I'm about to share with you. It was a Tuesday night in October 2018 when I was hauling a full load of consumer electronics from a warehouse in Phoenix, heading east toward Albuquerque. The manifest indicated that it mostly contained tablets, smartphones, gaming consoles, the kind of items that tend to attract thieves looking for a quick score on the black market. I had just passed through Flagstaff around 11 p.m., with the temperature gauge reading 38 degrees outside. Earlier that evening, my wife, Melissa, had called to remind me about our daughter's soccer game that weekend. I remember feeling eager to get home after this run. The CB radio was mostly quiet, just the occasional static while I had an old country playlist playing to keep me alert. That stretch of I-40 through Arizona can feel quite desolate after midnight, just darkness and the occasional coyote crossing the road. About an hour past Flagstaff, around midnight, I noticed two cars ahead acting a bit erratic. One was a dark blue sedan, likely a Nissan Altima with those aftermarket LED strips underneath that made it glow purple. The other was a silver SUV, probably a Chevy Tahoe, with heavily tinted windows and no front license plate. They were weaving between lanes, speeding up and slowing down, almost as if they were racing or just playing around. Initially, I thought it was just some kids being reckless, maybe under the influence, so I eased off the accelerator and kept my distance. The last thing I wanted while hauling 60,000 pounds of cargo was to get caught up with reckless drivers. But soon they began a strange synchronized maneuver, matching speeds perfectly side by side across both lanes for about 30 seconds before one sped ahead. My dashboard showed we were cruising at about 55 in a 75 zone, and something about their movements felt intentional, almost rehearsed. Everything changed in a matter of seconds. The Tahoe suddenly accelerated and pulled ahead about 200 yards, while the Altima remained directly in front of me, continuing its slow crawl. Then I saw the Tahoe's brake lights flare up like festive decorations as it jerked hard to the left, sliding sideways across both lanes. The tires screamed against the asphalt, leaving thick black marks visible in my headlights. My initial thought was that the driver had lost control, perhaps blown a tire because the SUV ended up perpendicular to the road, blocking both lanes. I hit my air brakes hard and the whole rig shuddered as 70,000 pounds of truck and cargo fought against momentum. It sounded like a giant metal beast groaning, and I could smell the brake pads burning. Thankfully, I had left enough space and managed to stop about 40 feet from the Tahoe. The Altima had slowed even further and was now creeping along in the right lane beside me, boxing me in against the median. My instincts kicked in before I could fully process the situation. After 23 years of marriage to a cop's daughter, you hear a lot of stories. Frank, Melissa's dad, had warned me about highway cargo theft rings operating out of Mexico and California. I reached for my CB radio with one hand while the other was ready to shift gears if I needed to break through. But just as I was about to key the mic, both car doors flew open and 4 men jumped out wearing black ski masks and dark coveralls. 2 came from the Tahoe with crowbars heading directly for my trailer's lock mechanism. The other 2 from the Altima ran toward my cab, one of them carrying what looked like a small sledgehammer. The guy with the hammer had a strange limp, but he moved quickly despite it. They didn't say a word, just moved with a chilling efficiency as if they had done this countless times before. I locked my doors just as the first guy reached my driver's side door. He began pounding on the window with his fist, not yet using the hammer, just testing. Through the glass, I could see his bloodshot wide eyes through the mask holes, perhaps high on something. The window rattled in its frame with each hit, and I knew it wouldn't hold long against that hammer. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but there was no signal out there. Just that frustrating no service message. My only chance was the CB radio, so I began broadcasting on Channel 19, the emergency channel monitored by all truckers. Breaker, breaker. This is eastbound I-40, mile marker 178. Attempted hijacking in progress. Need immediate assistance. 4 armed suspects. Static came back, then silence. The men at my trailer were making progress. I could hear the metallic grinding of crowbars working against the lock through my side mirrors. One of them had produced a portable angle grinder, and orange sparks were flying off my trailer doors like a 4th of July celebration. The limping guy finally raised the sledgehammer and swung it at my window. The safety glass spiderwebbed instantly but held together, white cracks spreading out like lightning bolts from the impact point. He reared back for another swing, and that's when I made my decision. I dropped the truck into gear and hit the accelerator, turning the wheel hard right toward the shoulder. The rig lurched forward with a roar that drowned out everything else. The 2 men at my cab dove away. The limping one actually rolled surprisingly well for someone with that limp. My plan was to maneuver around the Tahoe using the shoulder, even if it meant taking out some guardrail. But as soon as I started moving, I heard gunshots. 3 quick pops sounding like firecrackers, but definitely weren't. My passenger mirror exploded into pieces, and I heard another round punch through the sleeper cabin behind me. These were not just thieves. They were willing to kill for this load. I floored it, and the big Peterbilt 579 responded like an angry bull. The speedometer climbed past 40, then 50, approaching 60 as I aimed for the narrow gap between the Tahoe and the concrete median barrier. At the last moment, the masked men scattered like roaches when the kitchen light turns on. The shooter, a tall, skinny guy from the Tahoe, actually dropped his pistol and had to scramble back for it. My truck's front bumper clipped the Tahoe's rear end with a horrible shriek of metal against metal, spinning it about 90 degrees and shoving it into the median. The impact jolted me hard against my seatbelt, and my coffee thermos flew, spilling lukewarm coffee all over the dashboard. But I was back on the open highway, keeping my foot firmly on the accelerator. In my rearview mirror, I could see them running back to their vehicles. The limping guy moving surprisingly fast despite his disability. The Altima's engine roared to life first, its purple underglow creating a surreal streak of color against the dark asphalt as it gave chase. For about 3 miles, it was just the Altima and me in the strangest race of my life. They stayed about 50 yards behind me, matching my speed at around 75, which was pushing it hard for a loaded rig on that stretch. With each curve in the road, I felt the trailer wanting to swing wide, the cargo shifting inside with deep metallic groans. Then I saw it, a sight that nearly made me weep with relief. Red and blue lights appeared in my mirror, speeding up fast from behind the Altima. Not just 1 patrol car, but 3, along with what looked like an unmarked detective vehicle. The Altima immediately hit its brakes and attempted an emergency vehicle turnaround. But the cops were ready for that move. 2 units followed while the others continued toward me. Later, I found out that another trucker, about 10 miles behind me, had heard my CB call and managed to phone it in. Doug Brennan was his name, hauling produce from California, and I still send him a Christmas card every year for saving my life. That night, the police had me pull over at the next mile marker, and I sat there shaking while they checked on me. The officer who approached my cab was a young woman, probably not more than 25, with a thick Boston accent that felt entirely out of place in Arizona. Officer Kathleen Murphy, badge number 4417. Funny how certain details stick with you when you're in shock. She had me step out of the cab slowly, and that's when I noticed the damage. Beyond the missing mirror and bullet holes, there were pry marks along my trailer where they had been working on the lock. The angle grinder had cut about halfway through the thick steel before I drove off. Officer Murphy informed me that they had been tracking this crew for 6 months, targeting truckers carrying electronics between Phoenix and Albuquerque. They specifically aimed for solo drivers on Tuesday and Wednesday nights when traffic was lightest. The limping guy she mentioned was actually the ringleader, a former dock worker who had injured his leg in a forklift accident and knew which shipments were worth hitting. They caught 3 of the 4 that night. The Altima passengers surrendered quickly once the spike strips shredded their tires, but the limping guy somehow disappeared into the desert. The cops found the Tahoe abandoned about 2 miles from where everything transpired, still carrying traces of my truck's paint on its bumper. The 3 they arrested were all part of the same crew from Bakersfield, with records for armed robbery and interstate cargo theft. During the investigation, they discovered a notebook in the Altima containing detailed information about trucking routes, shipping schedules, and even driver names and habits. My run was marked with a red star and the note, "Electronic shipment, single driver, no team. Vulnerable at mile 175 on I-40. It turned out they had someone at the Phoenix warehouse feeding them information, a night shift supervisor named Glenn Howard who had been selling shipment details for $500 a pop. The FBI got involved due to the interstate implications, and I was required to testify at the trial 8 months later. My company offered me 2 weeks of paid leave after that night, but honestly, returning to the truck was harder than I expected. For the first month back, every time I saw 2 cars driving together at night, My chest would tighten and I would start sweating through my shirt. Melissa wanted me to quit, to find something local, maybe work in dispatch or become a driving instructor. But trucking is what I know, and I wasn't going to let those criminals take that away from me. I did make some changes, though. I started carrying a legal tire thumper that doubles as a solid defensive tool. I installed better locks on my trailer and began checking in with dispatch every hour during nighttime runs. The company also started sending high-value electronic shipments only with team drivers and began varying the routes randomly. That warehouse supervisor, Glenn Howard, received 7 years in federal prison for his involvement. The 3 caught that night received sentences ranging from 15 to 20 years for armed robbery and conspiracy. Unfortunately, the limping guy is still out there somewhere, and that keeps me vigilant with every run. 5 years have passed since that night on I-40, and I still drive that same stretch regularly. Every time I pass mile marker 178, I notice those fading black skid marks from the Tahoe, a reminder of that harrowing experience. Occasionally, other truckers will get on the CB in that area and ask if I'm the guy from the blockade incident. Word travels fast in our community. I always share the same advice. Trust your instincts, maintain your distance, and never assume you're alone out there, even when it seems empty. The investigation revealed that crew had successfully hit 11 trucks before they attempted mine, stealing over $3 million in merchandise. Those drivers all shared the same sentiment. It happened so quickly that they barely had time to react. The only reason I managed to escape was because I had been cautious about their synchronized driving for that additional mile, right before they made their move. That 30 seconds of intuition possibly saved my life, definitely saved the cargo, and played a part in dismantling a major theft ring. Last year, Officer Murphy informed me that similar crews are re-emerging, using the same tactics but now with motorcycles instead of cars. So yes, I still drive at night, still haul valuable loads, but now I watch everything and everyone as if my life depends on it. Because it genuinely does. I've been driving 18-wheelers for nearly 7 years, and honestly, the isolation never really affected me until that night in late November 2022. Many believe trucking is a man's world, and they aren't wrong. As a 34-year-old woman transporting freight across the country, I definitely find myself in the minority. On that particular run from Denver to Kansas City, I was carrying furniture that needed to arrive by morning. The weather was decent, cold, but clear, and I was making good time on I-70. Around 2 a.m., my body started signaling that it needed a break. I had already pushed beyond my usual stopping point to stick to my schedule, but my eyes were getting heavy, and my lower back was aching from sitting in the same position for hours. There was a little rest stop about 40 miles east of Colby that I had used before. It wasn't fancy, just a small parking area with restrooms, a couple of vending machines, and an ancient coffee machine that probably hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan administration. The place was almost empty when I pulled in, which was common for that hour. There was an old Peterbilt parked at the far end with its lights off, likely another driver catching some rest, and a beat-up sedan near the restroom building. I parked my Freightliner closer to the building than usual because the overhead light near the entrance was flickering, casting odd shadows that made the whole place feel like a scene from a bad horror movie. I grabbed my jacket, my phone, and double-checked that my pocket knife was clipped to my jeans. Standard practice for a woman alone at night. The cold hit me hard as I stepped out of the cab. That sharp plains wind cuts through you no matter how many layers you wear. I did a quick walk around my truck first, checking the tires and ensuring my load was secure, then made my way to the building. The restroom was as glamorous as you'd expect. Cracked tiles, a mirror so scratched you could barely see your reflection, and that overpowering smell of industrial disinfectant trying to cover up something worse. But it was functional, and that was what mattered. After freshening up, I headed over to the vending area where that old coffee machine sat humming against the wall. It looked like it belonged in a museum, one of those models with paper cups that drop down and fill while you watch through a grimy plastic window. I put a couple of quarters in and waited as it made concerning noises before finally producing something that vaguely resembled coffee. It tasted like burnt rubber mixed with battery acid, but it was hot and caffeinated, which was all I needed to get through the last stretch of my route. I stood there sipping that awful coffee and stretching my legs, peering through the glass doors at my rig under the flickering light. The sedan I'd noticed earlier was still there, but I could now see someone sitting in the driver's seat. a dark silhouette barely visible through the windshield. Something about their position made me uneasy. They seemed too still, too focused on the building entrance. But truckers encounter all kinds of odd sights at rest stops, and I had learned not to let paranoia take over. I tossed the half-empty cup in the trash and pushed through the doors, already calculating how many hours I had left to drive and whether I would need to stop again before reaching Kansas City. The refreshing cold air was a relief after the stuffy restroom, and I took a deep breath, ready to hit the road again. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of an engine starting up. Not the sedan, but something larger. A white van I hadn't noticed before was parked on the other side of the building, shrouded in shadows where the overhead lights didn't reach. It pulled out slowly at first, as if the driver was just leaving. But then the headlights swung toward me and the engine revved loudly. The van sped across the parking lot, tires squealing on the cold asphalt, and came to a harsh stop right between me and my truck, maybe 15 feet away from where I stood. The side door slid open even before the vehicle had completely stopped, and two men jumped out. One was tall and lanky, wearing a faded denim jacket, while the other was shorter but built like a linebacker in a black hoodie. They moved purposefully, as if they had done this before, spreading out to cut off any escape routes. The tall one reached for me, his face partially hidden under a baseball cap, but I could see his mouth moving, saying something I couldn't hear over the blood rushing in my ears. All those self-defense classes I had taken, every warning my mother had given me about traveling alone, and the horror stories I'd heard from other female truckers crystallized in that moment. I didn't scream or waste time trying to reason with them. Instead, I pivoted hard to my left, using the momentum to slam my elbow into the tall one's ribs as he lunged toward me. He grunted and stumbled, giving me just enough space to move. The shorter one was quicker than he looked, though, and his thick fingers caught my jacket sleeve, yanking me backward with enough force to nearly pull me off my feet. I could smell cigarettes and something sour on him, like old beer and sweat. Without thinking, I drove my boot heel down hard on his instep while twisting my body and ripping my arm free, leaving my jacket in his grip. The few seconds of confusion provided me a tiny window, and I seized it. I sprinted toward my truck, my boots slipping on patches of frost on the asphalt. Behind me, I could hear them cursing and their footsteps pounding after me. The tall one had recovered and was gaining ground, long legs closing the distance between us. My truck seemed impossibly far away, that flickering overhead light distorting everything. I reached for my keys while running, thanking God I always kept them clipped to my belt loop instead of in my pocket. I had the key fob in my hand and was hitting the unlock button repeatedly, hearing the beautiful chirp of my locks disengaging. Just as I reached the driver's side, I felt fingers grab at my shirt from behind, clutching the fabric. I spun around, swinging my fist wildly, likely catching the tall one somewhere in the face. I heard him curse and felt his grip loosen just enough for me to wrench free and grab the door handle. I pulled myself up into the cab with strength I didn't know I had, my muscles fueled by pure adrenaline. The shorter one had circled around and was trying to climb up on the passenger side, his fists pounding on the window while the tall one grabbed at my leg as I pulled it inside. I kicked out hard, my boot connecting with something solid, his shoulder or chest, and yanked the door shut with such force that the whole cab shook. The automatic locks engaged with a satisfying thunk, the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. They were both at my door now, the tall one's face pressed against the window, his breath fogging up the glass while he shouted things that turned my stomach. The shorter one was pulling on the door handle repeatedly, like it might magically open if he just kept trying. Their van was still running behind them, exhaust visible in the cold air, the side door hanging open like a mouth waiting to swallow someone whole. I fumbled for my phone with trembling fingers, managing to dial 911 while simultaneously starting my truck's engine. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, asking for my location, and I had to force myself to speak clearly, even though every instinct screamed at me to drive away from these men who were still circling my truck like wolves. The tall one had taken something out of his pocket, looked like a Slim Jim or some kind of tool, and was working it around my door frame while his partner kept watch. I told the dispatcher what was happening, reading off the mile marker I had memorized from the rest stop entrance, describing the men in their van while trying to keep my voice steady. She informed me that units were already on their way, that a state trooper was less than 10 minutes out, but 10 minutes felt like a lifetime when someone was actively trying to break into your truck. I threw the transmission into gear, ready to run them over if I had to, when I noticed something that made everything even worse. The sedan from earlier had pulled up behind my trailer, blocking me in. The driver was out now, and in the flickering light I could see it was a woman, thin and looking nervous, keeping watch while the two men continued their assault on my cab. This wasn't random. It was coordinated. These people were a team, and I had walked right into their trap. The dispatcher was still on the line, and I could hear her relaying information to the responding units, her voice a lifeline keeping me grounded amidst the chaos. The tall one's tool scraped against metal as he worked it deeper into the door frame. I knew it was only a matter of time before he figured out the right angle to pop the lock. The truck's engine rumbled beneath me like a caged animal, and I made a decision. I laid on the air horn, holding it down with my full weight. The deafening blast echoed across the empty plains. The sound was so loud it made my ears ring, but I didn't let up. The men stepped back, startled, covering their ears. That's when I saw my chance. I released the brakes and started rolling forward slowly, even with the sedan behind me. The woman saw what I was doing and scrambled back toward her car, probably realizing that my 18-wheeler would crush that little sedan like a tin can if I decided to reverse. The shorter man pounded on my hood with both fists, his face twisted in rage, while the tall one ran back toward their van, maybe going for a weapon or deciding this wasn't worth it anymore. I kept the horn going in rhythmic bursts. 3 long, 3 short, 3 long, SOS in Morse code, hoping that maybe the other trucker in the Peterbilt would hear it and understand. The dispatcher was asking me questions, but I could barely hear her over the horn and my own heartbeat. Then I saw them, red and blue lights in the distance, racing down the interstate. The moment those lights became visible, everything changed. The woman was already back in her sedan, tires spinning as she sped out of the parking lot. The two men ran for their van, the tall one slipping on the icy asphalt and nearly falling before catching himself on the vehicle's side mirror. They didn't even bother closing the sliding door before the van lurched forward, making a hard turn toward the exit. I relayed the license plate number to the dispatcher as they fled. It was from Nebraska, likely stolen, but at least it was something. The state trooper's cruiser came roaring into the rest stop less than 30 seconds after they left, quickly followed by another unit. My whole body shook so badly I could barely hold my phone. The adrenaline crash hit me like a wall. The trooper, a middle-aged black woman named Officer Washington, had to talk to me through the window for a full minute before I felt safe enough to unlock the door and step out. She was patient and professional, checking me for injuries while her partner secured the scene and called for additional units to search for the van. My shirt was torn where the tall one had grabbed me, and I had scratches on my arms that I didn't even remember getting. Officer Washington had me sit in her cruiser, where it was warm while I gave my statement, going through every detail I could recall. The denim jacket, the black hoodie, the woman's nervous demeanor, and that Nebraska plate. She took photos of the scratches on my truck's door frame, where they had attempted to break in and bagged my torn jacket, that the shorter one pulled away from me during the struggle. What she told me next made me realize just how fortunate I had been. They had been tracking this group for weeks. At least 4 attempted abductions along I-70 and I-80, all targeting women traveling alone at remote rest stops during late-night hours. 2 women were still missing. The method was always the same. The woman would arrive first in the sedan, acting as a lookout, identifying potential victims and ensuring there weren't too many witnesses around. Once she gave the signal, the van would move in for the grab. They had gotten sloppy with me, perhaps because I was in a truck and they thought I would be an easy target once I was out in the open, or maybe they were growing desperate. Officer Washington said my fight and the noise I made probably saved my life. Most victims had been taken before they could react, pulled into that van and gone before anyone was aware of what had happened. She kept me there for another 2 hours, reviewing mugshots on her laptop, coordinating with other departments, and ensuring I was okay to drive. By the time she finally cleared me to leave, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the Kansas plains in shades of orange and pink. I made my delivery 6 hours late, my hands still trembling slightly as I signed the paperwork. The client complained about the delay until they saw the police report number I handed them along with their invoice. They caught the criminals 3 days later at a rest stop near North Platte, trying the same thing with another woman who had, thankfully, seen the news report about my encounter and immediately locked herself in her car to call. Sven. The woman in the sedan turned out to be the girlfriend of the tall one, Nancy Garrett, a former nursing student who lost her license for stealing drugs. The shorter man was her cousin, Walter Briggs, with a 15-year history of assault, robbery, and kidnapping. The tall one, her boyfriend James Lawson, was the worst of them, connected to human trafficking rings operating across 3 states. I had to testify at their trial 8 months later, sitting in that courtroom and looking at them again, this time in orange jumpsuits and shackles. Nancy received 12 years, Walter got 20, and James was sentenced to life without parole. They found one of the missing women because of evidence in that van, alive but barely, locked in a basement in Iowa. The other woman was never found. I still drive trucks and still make that Denver to Kansas City run sometimes, but I've never stopped at that rest area again. I installed extra locks on my cab doors and started carrying pepper spray alongside my knife. Some nights when I'm driving alone and see a white van in my mirrors, my chest tightens, and I have to remind myself to breathe. But I won't let them take this job from me. This is my life, my freedom, and I'll be damned if I let 3 lowlifes make me afraid of the open road. Driving big rigs for 15 years has truly taught me to read people and situations, especially during those solitary moments on dark highways. I remember that September night in 2017 vividly. My old Kenworth was loaded with electronics making its way to Newark along Route 80 through Pennsylvania. The divorce papers were still fresh in my glove compartment, signed just that week. Honestly, that endless stretch of asphalt felt like the only therapy I needed. It was just me, the 60,000 pounds of cargo and the steady rumble of the diesel engine providing companionship in the darkness. Night driving had always been my preference. Fewer distractions on the road, better delivery times, and there was something almost meditative about watching the mile markers fade away while the world around me slept. I must have stopped at that Clarion truck stop 50 times over the years, always sticking to the same routine. Fuel up, grab coffee, check the load, and keep on moving. As I pulled off the highway around 2:00 a.m., the fuel needle was grazing empty, and my kidneys were crying out after 6 hours straight in the driver's seat. The truck stop was eerily quiet for a Thursday night, with only 5 or 6 trucks scattered about, their darkness punctuated by the soft glow of occasional sleeper cab lights. The overhead fluorescents at the diesel pumps flickered and buzzed, casting everything in an underwater hue, and shadows danced in strange ways. That was when I noticed him, a figure standing about 20 feet from the pumps just at the edge of the light, holding what looked like a piece of cardboard. He wasn't moving, not pacing or waving like most hitchhikers do. He stood there like a statue, clad in a thick canvas work jacket that seemed uncomfortable in the humid September air. The sign he held simply read East in black marker. Nothing else, no destination, no plea for help, just that one word. My first instinct was to ignore him completely, just fuel up and get back on the road. Yet something about his stillness stirred an odd feeling within me. As the diesel pump clicked and filled my tanks, I found myself glancing at him in the side mirror. He didn't shift his weight or look at the other trucks pulling in. He just stared straight ahead. In the dim light, I could make out that he appeared to be in his mid-40s, clean-shaven with a peculiar scar running from his left eyebrow down to his cheekbone, pale and thick like a worm. When the pump finally clicked off, I started putting the nozzle back when he began walking toward me, not hurried but with a sense of purpose, as if he had been waiting for me to finish. His boots were silent on the concrete, which seemed impossible given their weight. "Need a ride east," he said as he got closer, his voice flat, like someone reciting lines they had memorized without really understanding them. Up close, I saw his eyes were a washed-out gray, with barely any visible pupils. And he had a habit of not blinking that made eye contact feel extremely uncomfortable. His jacket bore old stains, dark patches that might have been oil, and it carried a strange scent of copper mixed with diesel exhaust. I told him I was only going as far as Brookville, about 40 miles up the road, thinking that might discourage him since most hitchhikers prefer longer rides. But he just nodded once and said, "That works," before heading toward the passenger side of my cab without waiting for my agreement. A knot formed in my gut, and every instinct screamed at me to drive away, to leave him standing there. I had given rides before many times, and what kind of person would leave someone stranded at 2 a.m.? He climbed into the cab with surprising agility for someone in such heavy boots, settling into the passenger seat like he belonged there. The interior light illuminated for a few seconds while the door was open, and I caught a better glimpse of his hands. They were completely hairless, even on the knuckles, with fingernails ground down to nearly nothing, and skin that appeared almost waxy under the dome light. He didn't have any bag or belongings, which struck me as odd for a hitchhiker expecting a long journey. As I drove away from the truck stop and merged back onto the highway, he sat upright, not leaning back in his seat, hands flat on his thighs as if posing for a photograph. The CB radio crackled with static, and I noticed the temperature gauge fluctuating oddly, dropping and rising despite the engine running at a steady temperature. About 5 miles down the road, he spoke again, asking what I was hauling. When I told him it was electronics, he made a peculiar sound. Neither a laugh nor a sigh, more like someone clearing their throat. Electronics, he repeated, as if tasting the word, unfamiliar with it. Expensive cargo, probably insured for what? $100,000, maybe more? The questions made my neck tense. That's not something you ask a driver you've just met. Information thieves are interested in. Then he inquired if I had a regular route, if I always drove alone, if anyone was tracking my progress that night. Each question came out in that same flat tone, devoid of emotion, as if he was mentally ticking off boxes. The way he didn't look at me while speaking but continued to stare ahead at the dark highway made the conversation feel like an interrogation. I kept my answers vague, lying about having to check in with dispatch every hour, mentioning my cousin would meet me in Brookville to take over driving. He nodded at each lie as if he knew precisely what I was doing, then casually asked if I had any weapons in the truck. My mouth felt dry as sand, and I gripped the steering wheel hard enough to make my knuckles ache. I told him I had a tire iron under the seat, nothing more, even though my .38 was right behind us in the sleeper compartment. He made that throat-clearing sound again and shifted slightly in his seat, the first real movement he had made since getting in. That's when I noticed his reflection in the passenger window didn't quite match his movements, as if there was a half-second delay between what he did and what the glass showed. "Tire iron?" he said slowly, as if filing that information away. "Useful tool. Can open a skull like a coconut if you hit it right." He said it so casually, as if discussing a recipe or a sports score, that my chest tightened. We passed a sign that read Brookville was 25 miles ahead, and I began calculating if I could make it that far. I thought about pulling into the next well-lit area and making up some excuse about engine trouble. Just then, he reached into his jacket pocket, slow and deliberate, and I tensed, ready to grab my pistol if needed. But he pulled out an old flip phone, one of those outdated models, pressing buttons without actually calling anyone. The screen wasn't even lit up, but he held it to his ear, pretending to talk to someone, giving them directions to our exact location and describing my truck down to the license plate number I hadn't told him. "Blue Kenworth, Pennsylvania plates, driver about 6 feet, heavyset, wearing a Steelers cap," he said into the dead phone. I hadn't been wearing a Steelers cap. I'd never owned one. Yet when I glanced in the rearview mirror, there it was, perched on my head like it had always belonged there. My John Deere cap was nowhere to be found. He continued his fake conversation, mentioning the mile marker we just passed, saying we had 15 minutes until they arrived, then snapped the phone shut, the sound like breaking bones. The next 10 miles felt like 100. Every shadow on the roadside appearing as another person waiting. Every set of headlights in my mirrors seeming to follow too closely for too long. He had returned to his statue-like position but was now humming something tuneless under his breath, just 3 notes repeating over and over again, drilling into my brain like a dentist's tool. I kept checking the dashboard clock, anxiously watching the countdown to those 15 minutes, wondering what would happen when they hit 0. At 12 minutes, I spotted an exit with a gas station sign, one of those bright Shell stations that are always bustling. In a split-second decision, I flipped my turn signal on. "No," he said, not loud but firm. His hand rested on the gear shifter between us, not grabbing it, but just placing his palm on top like a warning. "Brookville. You said Brookville." His fingers were ice cold, even through my thermal glove when they brushed against my hand, as if they had been soaking in freezing water. I pushed his hand away and yanked the wheel toward the exit, but the truck didn't respond correctly. It felt like the steering column had locked up. The exit ramp flew past while I struggled with the wheel, the truck perfectly maintaining its lane as if on rails. "Mechanical problems," he said in that flat voice, not a question but a statement. "Happens sometimes with these older models. Steering just gives out." But I knew my truck intimately, every sound and shake it made, and this was no mechanical failure. The wheel turned fine. The truck simply wasn't responding to it. The speedometer showed we were doing exactly 55. Yet outside the window, the trees blurred by as if we were speeding at 90. My GPS began recalculating incessantly, the voice repeating ruing over and over until I shut it off. Then I noticed them in the mirror. 2 sets of headlights that had been pacing us for the last 5 miles, maintaining a perfect distance, never falling back or getting closer. He must have caught my glance because he asked, "Friends of yours?" I'm making that not quite laugh sound again. That's when I decided to say to hell with it and reached back for my pistol, thinking that whatever happened next couldn't be worse than what they had planned. But my hand hit empty air. The sleeper compartment wasn't there anymore. Just a solid wall of metal as if it had never existed. The entire back section of my cab had somehow vanished, replaced by smooth steel. He watched me realize this with his unblinking gray eyes and said, "Funny how memory plays tricks. You sure you ever had a sleeper back there?" The Brookville exit sign appeared in my headlights, and without my having to touch anything, the truck began slowing down, the turn signal clicking on by itself. The 2 cars behind us moved into formation, one sliding into the left lane, one staying right, boxing us in as we headed down the exit ramp. My cell phone in the cup holder went dead, the screen black, refusing to turn back on no matter how many times I pressed the power button. The exit ramp seemed to stretch endlessly, curving into darkness where no lights appeared. Even though I knew a flying J should be right at the bottom. "Here's what happens now," he said, his voice suddenly different, more animated, more real than it had been the entire ride. "You're going to pull into that warehouse up ahead, the one with the broken windows and the red door. You'll back your trailer up to loading dock 3. Some people will unload your cargo. It'll take about 20 minutes, then you'll drive away and forget this ever happened. You won't call the police, won't file an insurance claim, and by morning, you won't even remember what I look like." The warehouse materialized from the darkness, looking abandoned but with fresh tire tracks in the gravel lot. The 2 cars followed us in, their lights extinguishing simultaneously. I thought about ramming the building, jackknifing the trailer, anything to stop this, but my arms wouldn't obey. They kept steering exactly where he wanted. As we approached the loading dock, I noticed more figures emerging from the shadows, all wearing the same heavy canvas jackets, moving with that same unsettling stillness between motions. The unloading process took precisely 20 minutes, just as he said. Those figures worked in perfect sync. No talking, no wasted movements, just box after box disappearing into the warehouse. The entire time he sat next to me, humming those same 3 notes, occasionally checking that dead flip phone as if it were showing him something I couldn't see. When they finished, one of the figures slapped the back of my trailer twice, and suddenly I could move again, my arms and legs tingling as if they had been asleep. "Drive," he said simply, and I did, backing out of the dock and heading toward the exit. But something within me snapped then, perhaps desperation or pure anger at being rendered helpless in my own truck. I grabbed the tire iron from under my seat, the one item that remained where it should be, and swung it at him as hard as I could while driving. The iron passed right through him like he was made of smoke, clanging against the passenger door. He turned to me, displaying what might have been disappointment. "Should have just kept driving," he said, and then he disappeared, vanishing as if he had never existed at all. My Steelers cap was gone, replaced by my John Deere one, and the sleeper compartment behind me looked normal again. My .38 was right where I had left it, and the scent of copper and diesel had vanished, replaced by the familiar aroma of coffee and air freshener. I pulled over at the real Flying J at the bottom of the actual Brookville exit, the one that had always been there, and called the police with trembling fingers. They found my cargo 3 states away a week later, most of it already sold off, but according to county records, the warehouse I described didn't exist, never had. The security footage from the Clarion truck stop showed me arriving for fuel, but there was no one at the pumps, no hitchhiker, just me standing there for 3 minutes, talking to empty air before getting back into my truck and driving away alone. They assumed I was in on it, of course, that I staged the entire incident for insurance money, but the charges didn't stick, because they couldn't figure out how I had done it. I no longer drive trucks. I work at a hardware store in Ohio now, and I never pick up hitchhikers, never stop at that Clarion exit, and definitely never drive at night. Sometimes I still hear those 3 notes he hummed, usually just as I'm about to drift off to sleep, and I wonder if he was ever truly there, or if something else entirely happened that night, something my mind won't let me remember clearly. That night when everything took a turn for the worse, I was transporting 40,000 pounds of packaged food from Nevada to Houston in my well-worn Kenworth. After 8 years on the road, I had learned a lot about recognizing dangerous situations. At 34, I was one of perhaps a dozen female long-haul drivers working that harsh desert corridor. It was August 2015, and even after dark, the heat was relentless, causing the asphalt to shimmer in my headlights. My rig, a faded blue truck I had bought at auction and rebuilt myself, had a paint job so worn that it appeared purple under fluorescent lights. After driving for 14 hours straight, my shoulders ached, and my eyes stung from the glare of oncoming headlights. I decided to stop at a massive truck stop just outside Amarillo. This place was enormous, featuring over 50 fuel pumps, a diner boasting the best chicken fried steak in Texas, hot showers with surprisingly good water pressure, and a convenience store that was always open. I always remembered this stop for its main neon sign, which had been broken for years and read Fuse Center instead of Fuel Center, a quirk that never failed to bring a smile to my face despite my exhaustion. When I arrived around 12:30 that morning, the lot was unusually crowded for that time, with at least 30 big rigs parked across the cracked asphalt, their engines humming alongside the buzzing insects attracted to the overhead lights. I carefully parked my truck on the eastern edge of the lot, close enough to keep an eye on the building but far enough from other trucks to allow for a quick getaway if needed, a habit developed from numerous close calls at rest stops. After fueling and grabbing what could only be described as the worst cup of coffee imaginable, think burnt motor oil mixed with chalk, I climbed back into my cab to handle the mandatory electronic logging system and maintenance reports required by my company every night. The dome light in my cab cast a warm yellow glow against the night outside, and I had cracked my driver's side window slightly to let in some air, as it was still around 90 degrees even at night. While I typed notes about a slow leak in my rear passenger tire and a strange grinding noise from the transmission that had started near El Paso, I heard footsteps crunching through the gravel next to my door. At first, the knocking was soft and almost polite, 3 gentle taps that barely registered over the sound of idling engines nearby. Glancing in my side mirror, I spotted a woman in her mid-20s, wearing an oversized gray hoodie despite the heat, and jeans that looked too clean for someone supposedly facing car trouble. Her messy bun and large hoop earrings glinted in the glow of the parking lot lights. Something about her demeanor felt rehearsed, as if she were an actress still struggling with her lines. She knocked again, this time more forcefully, and called out in a high, sweet voice with a slight southern drawl, claiming her car had broken down about a quarter of a mile up the road, and her phone was dead. Would I please help her call someone? The way she emphasized certain words felt a bit off, as if she were trying too hard to sound genuinely distressed. Keeping my door locked, I rolled the window down just enough to speak without giving her any chance to reach inside. From this angle, I noticed more details. Her makeup was flawless, no sign of smudged mascara despite her story about walking in the dark from a breakdown, and her white sneakers were immaculate. She began to express her fear of being alone at night, saying she had noticed my cab light and thought another woman would understand and help her. But while she spoke, I noticed her eyes darting toward the back corner of the lot, where the lights didn't reach. Adjusting my passenger mirror for a better view, I caught sight of 2 men standing by a dark sedan parked between 2 semi-trailers, around 60 yards away, watching us intently. One man was tall and skinny, wearing a baseball cap, while the other was shorter and stockier, hands shoved in his pockets, both positioned to move quickly if needed. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm and keep my expression neutral. I told the woman I would gladly call someone for her from inside the truck stop, and suggested she wait by the main entrance, where it was well lit and monitored by security cameras. She immediately shifted her tone, dropping the sweet act and insisting she couldn't walk because her ankle was twisted and she really needed to sit down. Couldn't I just let her use my phone for one quick call? Her right hand reached for the door handle, testing its give, while her left hand pressed flat against the window, leaving greasy fingerprints on the glass. That's when I noticed her professionally done nails, adorned with tiny rhinestones. Definitely not the nails of someone struggling with a broken-down car. She grew agitated, her voice rising, claiming I was being paranoid and cruel, saying that women should help each other, and expressing disbelief that I would leave her alone in such a dangerous place, especially with the truckers making comments inside. The 2 men began moving slowly toward my truck from different angles, trying to appear casual but clearly coordinating their approach. The taller man approached the passenger side, while the shorter one circled back toward the trailer, likely thinking I wouldn't see him in my mirrors. I grabbed my phone, ensuring the woman could see me dial, and loudly stated I was calling 911 to report a stranded motorist in need of assistance. The change in her expression was immediate. The feigned desperation evaporated and was replaced by a cold fury that transformed her demeanor entirely. She stepped back from the door and whistled sharply, cutting through the night air, causing both men to freeze. Without another word, she turned and walked briskly toward the dark sedan. Her supposedly twisted ankle miraculously healed. The men followed her, and within 30 seconds they were speeding out of the lot, tires squealing as they hit the access road. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, shaking and trying to process what had nearly happened. My shirt was soaked through with sweat that had little to do with the August heat, and I realized I had been gripping my phone so tightly, my knuckles had turned white and my fingers were cramped. A part of me wanted to just drive away and put as much distance as possible between myself and that place. But I knew I had to report this incident before they attempted it on someone else. Gathering my strength, I climbed down from my cab on shaky legs and made my way into the truck stop, heading straight for the counter where a young man, no older than 20, was working the night shift. His name tag read Bradley, and he had a poorly grown mustache and acne scars on his cheeks. When I recounted what had happened, his eyes widened in alarm and he immediately called his manager over. This older woman, Doy, who had likely been working at truck stops since before I was born, came over with her silver hair tied in a tight bun and arms that looked strong enough to handle anything. She listened intently as I shared my story, while pulling up security footage on a monitor behind the counter. Doy's expression went pale as she watched the footage, and she promptly called the state police while making a copy of the video files. It turned out this wasn't the first incident. She informed me that there had been 3 similar reports in the past month, always late at night and targeting solo drivers, particularly women or elderly men. The woman with the blonde hair had been seen each time, using various stories, sometimes car trouble, other times a lost wallet, and once claiming she was running from an abusive boyfriend. When the police arrived within 20 minutes, 2 officers took my statement and reviewed the security footage, zooming in for clear shots of the woman's face and the sedan's license plate. They reassured me that I had acted correctly in not opening my door, explaining that other drivers had been robbed at knife point in similar setups at different stops along the interstate, and one elderly man had been severely beaten when he tried to assist what he believed was a stranded young mother with a baby. The Sergeant Ramirez, with graying hair and a thick accent, showed me photos on his tablet of items recovered from one of the robbery scenes. A serrated knife about 6 inches long, zip ties cut from victims' wrists, and a roll of duct tape that made my stomach churn with the thought of their intentions. He told me they only knew the woman as Candy, from one victim who overheard the men use that name, clearly a pseudonym, and suspected the group was working their way along Interstate 40, hitting different truck stops every few weeks to avoid capture. The shorter man had a distinctive tattoo on his neck, a scorpion with its tail curled up, and they had been using different vehicles each time, likely stolen or borrowed specifically for these crimes. Ramirez handed me his card, explaining that a detective would follow up with me in a few days and that I might need to identify them in a lineup if they were apprehended. He strongly recommended I consider carrying pepper spray or some other legal form of protection. After the police left, Doy insisted on accompanying me back to my truck. This formidable woman marched beside me, wielding a baseball bat she kept behind the counter, her eyes scanning the lot like a vigilant guard dog. She shared that she had worked at the truck stop for 18 years and had encountered all sorts of dangerous situations. But something about this group particularly unsettled her, as they were becoming increasingly brazen with their tactics. Before I climbed back into my cab, she called over 2 other regular drivers, Bill and Antoine, who often ran the same routes as me. They immediately agreed to convoy with me for the next 100 miles until we reached a larger city where I would feel safer. I have never been more grateful for the camaraderie among truckers looking out for one another. Bill drove an old International adorned with Christmas lights year-round, while Antoine's truck was a beautiful black Western Star with chrome accents. Seeing them pull out ahead and behind me like protective escorts allowed me to finally breathe normally again. We continued driving through the night and into the morning, maintaining a steady pace while checking in with one another on the CB radio every 30 minutes. Bill lightened the mood with terrible jokes, suggesting that the woman probably needed the money for acting lessons due to her poor performance, while Antoine shared stories of his own near misses during his 2 decades on the road. When dawn broke, we stopped at a well-lit Love's truck stop near Oklahoma City, where they both insisted on inspecting my truck for any tracking devices the criminals might have placed on it while I was distracted. Though nothing was found, their concern highlighted just how sophisticated these robbery crews had become. Before parting ways, Antoine gifted me a small canister of bear spray he kept in his cab, technically illegal for use on humans, but better than nothing. Bill programmed his personal cell number into my phone, urging me to call if I ever felt unsafe at a stop again. I made it to Houston without any further incidents and delivered my load on time. However, that night changed how I approach my job forever. I now avoid working on paperwork with my cab light on at night, opting for a small red flashlight that doesn't draw attention to my location. I installed better locks on my doors and a security camera system that records everything around my truck, uploading to the cloud in case anything happens to the physical equipment. I also joined an online network of female truckers, where we share real-time updates about dangerous stops and suspicious situations. I have helped 4 other women evade similar setups by warning them about specific locations and tactics. About 6 months later, I received a call from the detective stating they had arrested the crew in New Mexico after they attempted the same scam on an off-duty cop driving his personal vehicle. The woman, whose real name was Ashley Donovan, received a 7-year sentence while the 2 men received 12 years each due to the weapons charges. However, what still troubles me is that during the trial, it was revealed they had successfully robbed at least 15 drivers before their arrest. Ashley testified that they specifically targeted women drivers because, in her words, they were more likely to want to help another woman in distress. That sense of betrayal, of someone manipulating the instinct to assist one another, is what lingers with me more than the fear.